Okay, so we're at our final webinar, and this will be taped for other students if they didn't catch this one tonight, but we're going to get started now. So what I'm going to be covering tonight is both week 9 and week 10's the course notes. So it'll be for the next couple of weeks, the week that we're already in, and then next week's course notes. They're similar in terms of what they cover, and you'll see when I get into the materials. And then the last week is pretty much turning in finals, and then I may have a couple of last-minute announcements, but it's pretty much wrapping up the course at that point. Vinny's been here before, so we're going to skip the agenda as we've been handling it before. Same thing with if there are any questions, use the or comments, use the question function, and then I'll read it, which I'll read it anyway in case anybody's listening to the tape. So the course notes for this week had to do with sort of alternative methods that unions are using to try to organize workers. And I think it's an important point because the old way of doing things, that is sort of the traditional, what I call an NLRB campaign, that is one that's a campaign intending to have a traditionally supervised election or monitored election using the NLRB or public sector rules for the purposes of forming a collective bargaining unit that will be certified by a government agency for the purposes of collective bargaining. There's a lot of problems with that process in that, it was fine a long time ago when unions were stronger and companies at one point didn't dump as much money into anti-union firms. But that's long changed, and our Democratic, what were allies, have changed their stance on labor to a large degree, as we found out with the last type of labor reform that we tried in 2009 and 10, which didn't go anywhere. So there is that legislative remedy to try to fix the process somehow, but as I explained in my collective bargaining course, we've had a number of Democratic presidents and Democratic Congresses at the same time, majority Democratic Congress, which didn't do anything. There was no labor law reform. The newest of those administrations being the Carter administration with the Democratic House and Senate, the Clinton administration with the Democratic House and Senate for a period of time, and then the Obama administration for the part of the first administration, first part of the administration, and it just didn't happen. So the idea is, do we keep going down that same road, which seems to be getting worse and worse and worse, or do we change our tactics in some way? Because the goal is to try to have an effective way of advocating for workers, not just have collective bargaining. Not that that's not an effective method, but the process has changed since the 50s when we used to have sort of an agreed-to set of rules, so to speak, and those rules have changed where the other side just won't do it anymore, and it's changing the way that they do things. So the reasons we need to look for have to adapt the way that we gain membership is the NLRB is at the mercy of Congress for funding, and that's a real problem when there are things like the sequester cuts that are in place, or when the government is defunded, or when there is a Republican president with a Republican majority Senate and House, or majority House. Money dries up, and we went through that period with Reagan and the Bushes where there weren't appointments to the NLRB, and they ran for a long time with a 3-member instead of a 5-member panel with the NLRB, the board itself. They drained funds from the individual regional offices, so for a long time there was no director of the regional offices to actually run the business of the office, or there was no funding. So when there was a vacancy for, whether it was an administrative law judge or the directors themselves, hearings didn't happen, and they were delayed for a long, long time in many cases. And in the meantime, the employers working away at the employees to try to get them to convert from supporting the union and saying, look, the union can't even schedule an election. How effective are they going to be with collective bargaining and arguments like that? And so that is a major hurdle. There's anti-union administrators that have been appointed, with the NLRB, and that's been difficult. There are anti-union consultants more than ever that are nastier than ever. Difficult economic times you would think would make organizing easier because you think, well, if people are not being treated fairly, if they're worried about security, that sort of thing, you think that the union message would appeal to people like that. But just the opposite happens, and there's all kinds of documentation on this with the decline of union membership and decline of union organizing connected with difficult economic times. And frankly, it's because people are like, well, at least I have my job. It might be crappy, I might not be treated well, but at least I have my job, and they'll hunker down and wait it out, and they will not, they will not see the union's message as appealing. Bad publicity from the media, that happens. It's also captioned with the next one was bad union actions, that is whether it's bona fide illegal actions like running away with the Treasury, in which either the union itself polices itself internally and disciplines those people or has them turned over to the authorities for prosecution, or the Justice Department gets involved. Either way, unions get painted with this broad brush whenever there is either a bad campaign that went really badly, that gets reported, especially if it's a larger national campaign. That gets reported by the media as, oh, the union's lost another one against employer X or Y. And people just, without knowing the details, just hear that headline or read that headline and believe, well, geez, maybe unions aren't the answer. Or if there's criminal allegations, like the traditional one is walking away with the Treasury or somehow absconding with funds, these anti-unions consultants use this as fodder for, look how bad the unions are, that you can't trust them with your money. So there's a number of reasons why things aren't working the way they were intended back when the National Labor Relations Act and the various public sector laws were created over time. So, what can we do differently? Well, unions have come up with a number of different approaches, and my own thoughts on this is that you have to do all of these at some point, because you can't just think that there's only one way of organizing workers, because each industry or employer or group of workers, set of workers, are different, and one way may not appeal to them from other ways. So there's still traditional organizing, which unions put a lot of money and a lot of effort in, and that is using the traditional legal rules, as it were, to create a collective bargaining unit, which will then bargain a contract and service the contract on behalf of a group of members, and hopefully with those members. There are community campaigns, and this is one that unions have been using for probably about 30 years or so, in that an employer like the Walmart campaign, for an example, basically showing various cases where injustices have been committed by the employer against workers, and they try to get the workers, along with other unions and the broader public, religious groups, etc., to buy in and participate in the campaign to pressure the employer to do everything from changing their ways and hopefully creating a better workplace for the employees to being less hostile to union organizing, or some steps in between. And that apparently is quite effective, because as I talked about in the notes, that there are chambers of commerce and other advocacy groups for employers, large advocacy groups, that are pressuring the National Labor Relations Board and their Republican allies in Congress, and the Republicans in the House have been holding hearings on this. And essentially it's to try to declare community campaigns or other campaigns, whether it's a workers' rights board or workers' rights center, workers' center, as having to qualify under the National Labor Relations Act. So that's an important piece of this, of what has been going on with, sort of the non-traditional approaches to bargaining. So community campaigns is another way of doing that. One of the things that Anna had mentioned in her posting that she has been doing for her research project about the car wash employees, that would be a type of community campaign in a way, because it's broader than just talking about the employees and the employer, that it involves other elements of the community. And many of you have helped her with some ideas, and that's always a good thing. That's the whole idea of those discussion areas. Teaming with nonprofit groups. When my union was interested in organizing child care employees who work out of homes, that is, they open their homes to, and they're licensed by the various New York State child care, I think it's the Department of Office of Child and Family Services. And what we did was we teamed up with a nonprofit out of New York City who helped us to organize, actually provided a lot of the foot workers to knock on the doors where the child care centers were, and then we helped with funding and literature and some of our staff to work together. So it was teaming with a nonprofit group in order to organize a set of workers. And in that case, it turned out to be a collective bargaining campaign, but we weren't sure that it would be to begin with. And that has to be clear to the union, as you may not be successful in creating a collective bargaining unit. I know the communication workers, I have a cousin in Colorado who was involved with the IBM group, that the Communication Workers of America, CWA, were involved and still are involved in organizing. And it was essentially a national group to shed a light on the practices, the pension practices and pay practices and sort of forced retirement practices that IBM has been doing for a number of years with their employees. And they never expected to get a collective bargaining campaign out of that. But it still had value to advocate on behalf of these tech workers, which, CWA has basically moved for a large part into that sector as their many of their organizing, the future of their organizing ideas. Non-collective bargaining organizing, and that's one of the things that I showed you when we had the charts of different kind of campaigns from last week. One of them was a non-collective bargaining campaign and the expectations from it. And sometimes you have to do that, whether it's the example of CWA with the IBM employees, like I mentioned, or whether it's because in the public sector, because collective bargaining may be illegal in a particular state, or because a state may be a right-to-work state, and it's difficult to garner that initial support for a collective bargaining campaign. So essentially organize the campaign as a non-collective bargaining advocacy campaign, building over time to what you hope will become a collective bargaining organizing campaign. But basically building the structure, the support, knocking down all the straw men that the employer will set up as reasons not to get involved with the union. And essentially what you do is you, as they say, you pave the road by walking it. You build the organization and let the employees build it and elect their officers and hold meetings and take on issues with the employer, etc., without collective bargaining, participate in political action. So when the employer says, so let's say you eventually switch over to saying we're going to go for collective bargaining, and the employer says, well, here's why you don't want that, because unions are controlling and blah, blah, blah. Well, the employees already have an experience with their own bargaining unit, per se, a unit, maybe not a bargaining unit yet, but they have an idea of what it's like. They've maybe been to meetings, they've been approached by people who are their coworkers who are active in the union, they have elected officers, they've gotten emails, the different things that every union goes through to function. So it's easier to knock down the employer's straw men when they've already lived it. Broad community campaigns. I'll give an example of that in just a minute, but there is an attempt to have a broader campaign that isn't just employer or industry based. And the idea with that is it's kind of a cross-section between a worker center that, again, we'll talk about a little bit and was covered in the notes, or I think will be covered in the notes next week, between a worker center and a sort of like an advertising campaign almost. So maybe you've been familiar with advertising campaigns that many times some unions will do, public sector unions, at least in New York I've seen it, around an issue or a budget issue, or don't cut health care, don't cut education, those kind of commercials. Well, it's kind of a cross between straight advocacy and a publicity campaign so that people can become familiar with a union or union work on behalf of a broad community instead of just an industry or a specific employer. And I'll get to that in a minute. Campaigns aimed at, I was having a hard time describing what this was, but at raw materials to the sales process. So essentially, one of the things that was in the notes was there's a group of unions that are working together, and they're trying to organize from the farm to the table, in essence. So they're trying to organize the farm workers, the processing plants, the warehouses, as well as the retail operations that sell whatever the goods are that are processed from farm to table. And it has not been done that I've heard of in a long, long time. It's a very comprehensive campaign. There's smaller unions that are doing it. A couple of them are mainstream, but they tend to be smaller unions involved with some of the portions of it. But they have a way to coordinate their material, their campaigns that way, because they are talking about the same industry, one employer feeding another employer, feeding another employer. That is sort of the raw fruits or vegetables, let's say, or meat products being fed into a processing plant, and then they process the meat, package the meat, then it going into warehousing, whether it's cold storage or traditional warehousing, and then it goes from there to a variety of stores or a big chain or what have you. If there's a way to organize that flow, that entire flow of food or packaging or product, then that's another twist. It's another way that you can use the leverage of maybe not pressuring just one employer, but pressuring the whole process at one time through maybe connecting that with a broad campaign or with nonprofits that maybe organize in a particular area for, let's say, immigrant rights. And in many food processing plants, of course, in farm labor and in warehousing, depending on where you are, but in many areas of the country, there are migrant workers, mostly from Mexico and some other countries south of us, that produce a lot of that labor. So teaming up with an immigration rights group or other similar group would make some sense to pressure the employer. And again, just putting another tool in your tool bag that you could use to think out what's a comprehensive way that we can approach this. Now, none of these are really that easy, as you can tell. I mean, I can almost hear that we got 3 people on the call tonight. So, many of you, maybe sort of your eyes spinning in their sockets, like, how would you even think about doing something like this? Well, it takes a good chunk of people, really smart people, and unions like people like yourselves have really smart people in their unions that are willing to think creatively and out of the box and put a lot of time into figuring out how to do this and teaming up with allies, etc. And putting together a strong campaign costs money, but that's the idea of partnering up with any other groups, because some of the costs could be shared at that point and with other unions. So there's a way of doing it, but it needs to be out-of-the-box thinking. And I think that's really where we need to be and are starting to move towards, with a variety of different kind of of campaigns that are out there. Let's get into those a couple. So here's a couple of examples of what they look like. So there's one called Fight Back Pittsburgh, and the steelworkers used to be a large union in the Pittsburgh area because Pittsburgh had a lot of steel industry and related industries to steel. Both my parents were from Pittsburgh, so I know that in the 80s when there was a couple decades of disinvestment in the steel industry and in the related industries, that they found other places. Either they found other places to build new plants, or they just downsized the plant, the steel mill, or they were out underbid by either foreign competitors that had more modern steel processes, or other American steel processes that put money into their steel companies that put money into their processes and updated them. And as a result, I mean, there were just communities devastated by unemployment, and it really took Pittsburgh decades to come back to what it is now. Now, it's still not back as you would look at it in its prime, as is true with a lot of cities in the area. You know, Buffalo, for an example, has been devastated by cuts in steel and other industries as well. But the steelworkers, after a long time, unfortunately, they got some creative people on board, and they have a campaign called Fight Back Pittsburgh. And it is open to anyone in the Pittsburgh area. It has pretty modest dues. You can look at their website there. And they have an action, I believe it's each Monday somewhere. And it's varied. And basically they have yard signs in people's yards that say Fight Back Pittsburgh. You know, if you know of unfair practices at a workplace, call us, and it's got their website and phone numbers. It's a way to get publicity, and the steelworkers have really branched out who they represent, just because their old industries are much smaller and aren't growing. So they represent, you know, still some steel-related industry, but it's everything from, they represent the staff of a couple of different unions that I'm aware of. The Public Employee Federation here in New York State, state employees, they represent their staff union, their steelworkers, and they represent a number of other kind of industries and workplaces, some really small, some larger. So what they're trying to do is just find out, is there anything here that we can start a campaign with? And basically, the view has been seen in the past. I mentioned last week's call about Alcoa, and how they were painted with a broad brush of, you know, it's because of the union that the Alcoa plant was shut down. Well, there was a similar view, unfairly, with the steelworkers back in the 80s that, you know, if we didn't have these expensive unions, you know, they never look at it as if we had high-quality wages that help our community, but if we didn't have these expensive unions, you know, maybe these plants wouldn't have left, and they were going to leave no matter what. Well, this is a way that, you know, the steelworkers are hoping to reestablish themselves in the mind of a new generation of workers of, you know, we're not the old steel mills that, you know, there's all too many pictures of left and right from, you know, years gone by, but this is a new union that wants to fight for everybody in Pittsburgh. We're part of the community. We want to help Pittsburgh rebuild itself, and we want to be a part of that rebuilding. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is, this is actually Community is actually a British union. It's communitytradeunion.org, community-tu.org. It's a British trade union, but look at the tagline under there, the Union for Life. Interesting. And the way that their logo says community with unity highlighted in that. So what this is it was a couple of very old, what we would know as Rust Belt industry unions. And you can look up their history on their website. And they were dying. I mean, the two unions were bleeding members badly. What they decided to do was, the first thing was to merge their unions. And they did that. They formed one organization. And that was not easy, because everybody has their own turf and their own bylaws and officers and everything that goes along with mergers of unions. They're always difficult, it seems. And the other thing they did was they started, and this is interesting, it's a side note, but it's interesting, they started reporting their real membership numbers to their national organization. So like the equivalent of our AFL-CIO or state AFL-CIO, or if you're connected with a larger state body, everybody inflates their numbers. I mean, I know one union, a large state union here in New York, has had the same numbers since I worked there, and that was back in the mid-'80s. And they're not the same size. They're smaller. The problem is when they use those numbers for publicity purposes, they also pay dues on those numbers to the larger union and to, ultimately the AFL-CIO, whether it's the local branch of it or the national group through their national federation affiliate. So what they did was they said, we're going to report our real numbers. So they reported the real numbers, and they saved a bunch of money. Now, they had to show that they were much smaller than everybody thought they were, but it worked out to be in the best interest of the union. The other thing they did was they represent still sort of the traditional, where they can, the traditional places that they had represented workers, but they also started getting involved with community issues. And they developed a philosophy over time that was, we should be a place that workers come for anything, whether it's child care issues, whether it's training they need to get a better job, whether it's information on unemployment, whatever the issue is, we want the new community center, so to speak, to be the union. So that down the road, they have hopefully this positive experience with a union, and then when it comes time for injustice in the workplace, the idea is who they will think of to try to help them to resolve the problem or to fight the injustice is the union that they've been connected with all along. It's a very interesting idea that I don't think that in this country we paid enough attention to, actually thinking about what this would look like, even on a trial basis. There's nothing wrong with trying things, and I think that's where we need to go, is to experiment a little bit. So Community, the Union for Life, check out their website. They're very interesting with their approaches. Fast Food Forward and groups like it. There are a couple of different unions that are working with this group of fast food employees. SEIU has been working with them, the service employees, the food and commercial workers, I believe, maybe the retail workers have. They've been getting advice from a couple different groups. And it's essentially their campaign is focused around raising the minimum wage for fast food workers, the entry wage, to $15 an hour, and then citing case after case after case how the old stereotype of fast food workers just being made up of teenagers that don't really need a living wage because they're just doing this as transient work or to supplement work while they're at school, etc., isn't true at all. That over 40% or over 60% of the workers are doing this for a living. They're trying to carve out this as a living, and they're forced to work 2 or 3 different jobs along with it because it doesn't pay enough. But they've been there for more than 10 years working in the fast food industry. So back a month or so ago, they actually had a strike, a nationwide strike, and they had over 60 cities were participating in it to bring awareness to this idea of the plight of fast food workers, that they're not just, the stereotype of a pimply-faced kid, with squeaky voice handing you your Coke at your drive-thru, that these were moms with kids, that these were a dad who also worked as a custodian in the evening because they were laid off from where they used to work, etc. These are more than just the stereotypes that we've come to accept to some degree. So those are some ideas, and in the notes that I have for this week, there's a number of other examples that I give. SEIU, the service employees, have been involved with this idea back since the 70s, late 70s, with 925, where the famous Dolly Parton song came from, in the movie as well, this concept of organizing what were secretaries, now administrative professional employees, and advocating for them, to a variety of other examples that I give. So these are just a couple of other examples. And then the notes for next week I'll go over now, just because this is our last webinar, so I'll go into that. It dovetails this, but it's basically workers and their other advocates aren't willing to wait for the labor movement to sort of reinvent itself and figure out how it's going to organize workers, that they've been moving with and without unions. Some have been partnering with unions and these different ideas, and some, whether intentionally or not, have just gone on their own. And there, in some cases, workers are forming their own independent organizations, and they're outside of the traditional sort of House of Labor, the AFL, or I should know this, the split-off organization from the AFL, but you know, the two national organizations, and Change to Win, and you know, they're not waiting. In many cases, they're religious and nonprofit groups that are organizing workers as well, and this is particularly true where there are not a lot of unions, but there is interest from the local community and advocating on behalf of workers. Advocacy differs depending on the part of the country, the issues involved, and ethnic groups may come into play with this also. Some of the organizing that's done may be just around ethnic groups. There is a group of taxi drivers in New York City. Now, taxi drivers many times are misclassified as independent contractors. In some cities, they own their own cabs, but they don't really control their own livelihood. They still use the traditional dispatcher system to tell them where to go, when to go, etc. But they're misclassified as independent contractors, and therefore the employer doesn't report them in their earnings for tax purposes, unemployment insurance, Social Security, etc. And some of those groups, like in New York, are around ethnic groups. If anybody's been to New York in a cab, you know, you will find people from many different parts of the globe that drive cabs, because you know, driving is something that's kind of universal to a large extent. Issue-oriented campaigns. There's a group in Vermont that I'll show in a minute that basically is having a large campaign to get people's attention around the issue of having sick leave, something that years ago you wouldn't even have blinked an eye at about do you have sick leave or not, and now it's an area where employers are cutting back on having sick leave at all, or are cutting back the number of days that employees have. Well, this one group decided to take that on as a major issue, along with advocating for health care and other issues, and justice at work issues. But the sick leave issue has really been their hallmark, and they've really gotten a lot of traction from employees who you know, want to be able to take time off if they need it because they or their immediate family is sick. And these groups are helping unions to think outside of the box, because as these groups are developing and are having success, unions are saying, wow, what's happening over there, and how come they're not connected with us in some way? You know, almost like the shock that workers could organize themselves, or could organize with a nonprofit separate from a traditional union to set up an advocacy group or an independent union, is shocking to some unions, which it shouldn't be, because if we're not reaching out to these groups, or we are only looking into the traditional areas that we've always organized, or worse yet, we're stealing members from each other, instead of the 92 or 3% of workers that have no union in the private sector, then they're not going to wait for us. So some examples of these. The freelance union. The freelance union is an interesting idea, and I just stumbled upon them a few months ago. They started in New York City, and now we're trying to build a national base for themselves. And they're kind of a union. Basically what they're saying is a third of all workers in the country are freelance workers. That is, they're independent contractors is kind of another name for that. And they're everything from domestic workers who do child care in home, do nanny work, do cleaning in houses, to, you know, painters that may do commercial painting on their own, to people in a number of small industries. People who work in the arts many times are freelance employees. People who work in sort of the athletic areas. For example, my wife is working to build a company that does yoga, teaches yoga. She's been teaching yoga for a number of years, and also health coaching. And to do that, if she made that leap successfully, as her sole employment, she would be a freelancer because she would be on her own with this. So it's kind of a small business, but it's kind of, you do work with others or other businesses at the same time. So what they did was they can't use the traditional collective bargaining model because they're not collective in the sense that there's no one employer they would bargain with. There's a number of people they work with, or individuals or families that they work with. So what they did was they found a way to gather themselves around the issue of health insurance before Obamacare came in, and they've actually gotten some exemptions from the Affordable Care Act standards because they're unique in what they do. So they've been exempted from some of the standards that the law requires for other forms of insurance. So they have their own health insurance. They have a method for helping each other to write good contracts in terms of service contracts, so they're treated fairly by whoever employs them for their services. And a number of other things that are really unique if you think about it from how we've always come to think about unions. But it's a large segment of the population that is now getting help from themselves. And essentially it was a couple of labor attorneys that set this up back in '95. And it's grown, and it has, they're claiming, over 200,000 members. A lot in New York City, but also outside of New York City now. So it's an interesting model to look at, to think about, you know, your group and your union and who you work with or might want to work with in the future. What would that look like? Again, it's a different model that gets us thinking, which is always healthy. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and I hope I'm saying that right, they're basically ethnic farm workers in southern Florida that they grow a lot of tomatoes, as an example, for everything from Pizza Hut to Taco Bell and others. And they do a very different form of organizing. Instead of saying, why don't we go to Farmer Joe, who we work with, and demand higher wages, which is sort of the traditional way that farm workers have organized. That is the United Farm Workers in California, the whole idea of the Great Boycott, which was very famous. Instead of doing that, what they did was they said, why don't we put pressure on the end user of our product? So not the farmer, not those who transport, but what if we target Taco Bell and Pizza Hut and others who are the end users, large end users, and what we'll ask for is a nickel more for a pound of tomatoes that they use, which first of all, they're going to pass it on to the users. And second of all, it doesn't really have a large effect on the bottom line, was the idea. And they actually won. They had a national campaign. We had a labor religion coalition here in Rochester that I was involved with back a few years ago, and there was a museum that was being built and wanted to have food there, and they wanted to have fast food, and they were thinking about Taco Bell, and we knew about the Immokalee workers and their boycott, if you will, of Taco Bell because of the tomato issue, and we raised the issue with the board of directors of this museum, and they knew nothing about it, were alarmed by it, and did the right thing and did not use Taco Bell, and instead, at that time anyway, used a local chain. So it was local people and local owners that got the opportunity to put a restaurant in rather than, you know, just another Taco Bell. So it was a win-win, and it was enough pressure that they actually got the increase they were looking for from Taco Bell. And Taco Bell hasn't gone under, and people are still driving through and ordering their oh-so-healthy food. You know, it gives you an idea of a different way of thinking about how to organize workers. And theirs is primarily around, it's around an industry, but it's also around an ethnic group. So take a look at their website, too. Maybe you've heard of them because they've been out there for a while, but take a look at their website, too. Another one is the Western North Carolina Workers Center, which is a mouthful. But basically, they are a religious group, and this is one that does not participate with unions because they're in Western North Carolina, and there just aren't a lot of unions there. I think the what was left of the old clothing manufacturer unions like Unite Here and some others. There just weren't many left in the western part of North Carolina. So the religious groups started, and a number of pastors got together and started it. They do some really interesting advocacy, and they tend to use the worker center model, where and a lot of what they advocate for is on behalf of low-wage African American workers and also for immigrant workers who do different types of work in that section of North Carolina. But again, it's thinking out of the box, another way to organize. The Vermont Worker Center is very active, and they are the one that advocates primarily, although not exclusively, around the issue of sick leave for workplaces. They have a really interesting, very active campaigns that have been ongoing, one of them being around sick leave, and another one being around health care to make sure everyone gets coverage. And again, their campaign predates the Affordable Care Act. But that's another example of how worker advocates and workers themselves are advocating and thinking out of the box. And we can really learn something by not being tied to, we've always done it this way. Excuse me, in that way of thinking, because, as I said back at the top of the hour, we're having problems with that. The old rules aren't working. The other side is catching on to the way we've been doing business and are finding ways to beat us. So we have to adapt how we do things and frankly reach out to the other 92, 93% of Americans that are non-union, that may want in some way to be affiliated or connected with a union or a larger advocacy group that they can participate in and be helped by. So that's primarily what a good chunk of next week's notes are going to be about. But other good websites for you to check out will be presented there as well. So any questions that you might have about either anything you've come across in the week's reading or anything that I went over tonight that that you might want to ask a question about, feel free to jump in and ask me about that. Okay, Bill has, you talked about partnering with nonprofit organizations. I work for county government. We lose jobs to non-union nonprofits. Any tips on organizing them? Well, there might be a way to do that, and I think there's a couple things to do. I was at a conference about a month ago in Syracuse, and it was about, and this is an area that I did not touch on in this because I actually want to do a webinar on this separately that you'll hear about when I can get the materials together for, but it'll be separate from this course. And it's about worker cooperatives, the idea of workers owning their own enterprises and running them small d democratically. And it looks a lot from the outside like a traditional business, but the employees have control and are the sole shareholders of the stocks, if you will, or the shares that run the organization, so that an outside entity can't come in and take the work away, et cetera. So now you're saying, so what does that have to do with being county government? So the idea, what I was thinking about with a representative from the group that was one of the host organizations at this conference was, well, what if they, being this federation of the U.S. Federation of Cooperative Workers, I think the name of the group was, what if you worked with unions that actually did some pre-training of, instead of nonprofits getting the work for social services, for an example, because they're pretty famous in, but not exclusively. What if the employees themselves could have a way to have an independent entity separate from the county that would do the work and still be connected with the union? Now, again, this is one of these areas that you have to sort of like think about, like how would that work and what would that look like? The steelworkers, oddly enough, along with the Pittsburgh organization they have, in Ohio, they're actually actively working with groups to set up worker cooperatives in which the owners, the workers, are connected with the steelworkers union. So they maintain that connection. So yeah, there is a way that you can, so part of it is with the nonprofits, and this has been tried in Rochester. The Federation of Social Workers in Rochester, which is connected with what was the IUE and is now the Communication Workers. They have a website, you can look them up. What they have done is they've done things like they're trying to change how they're viewed in the public from just being a social service union to being a human services union. And they have a Human Services Worker of the Year award. And they name people that are not only county employees, but have been very active and successful in human services work in the broader community. And it gets not headlines, but it gets mentioned in the daily paper here in Rochester. They have a luncheon. They invite both union and non-union human service workers. So they integrate more so with the broader community of human service workers and are not seen as hostile to them, like they're going to take our jobs so we're not going to talk with them. Well, the idea is, you know, what if we had folks that have been working for the county that now work for this human services entity? Why do we sever our relationships with them? Is there a way that we can use that new relationship to find out what's happening within this new organization and try to find a way to broaden our influence, if you will, within the new human service organization that is doing the work that your bargaining unit members have been doing? So that's sort of a longer-term strategy of building an organization of union members within the organization of the human service, the nonprofit entity, but without right up front going at it as a collective bargaining campaign, because then you're going to get all the traditional reactions to collective bargaining. So using some of the techniques that I just went over could be a solution long term. Short term is having really good contract language that defends the contract and the bargaining unit from subcontracting is really, really important. And all too often we've settled in contracts that say, and this is not just your union, this is many unions, that say as long as nobody's laid off, you can subcontract work. And so what they'll do is they'll hang out to the employees for a while, or they'll have a buyout, or they'll have an early retirement package. They'll do some deal to get rid of a bunch of employees so that no one on paper was laid off per se, but we still lost the unit work. And being vigilant about advocating and defending your bargaining unit's work through the contract, through grievances if appropriate, through unfair labor practices for the private sector and public sector, improper practice charges or whatever they're called in your state, is really important, because as soon as we stop defending our unit's work, then it opens the door for others to come in and take the work, and that's happened in a number of places. But I think that sort of primary defense, if you will, coupled with some creative thinking on how we can broaden our appeal and sort of rebrand ourselves from the social service union to a human service workers group that cares about the broader community, and basically becoming a broader community union, if you will, I think is going to have more success in the long term. So that's my thinking on that one. Anybody else have a question? Not seeing any others here. Okay, well, if you do, just feel free to type in there. I'm going to move on. So let me, before I get into, is there anything else that you want to talk about? So just the final exam will be available on Monday the 25th, which is this coming Monday. I initially said last week it was going to be due the following Monday, which was the 2nd. And I got thinking it was pretty unfair because, people travel and have time with their family around Thanksgiving, and the last thing you want to be doing is to, carving a turkey while you're trying to figure out what to put in your final. Rather than doing that, I'm going to tack a couple days onto that. I need to get grades in sooner, but I also want to make sure that the exam is back. So the exams will be back by Wednesday the 4th. They'll be available on the 25th, so you'll have about a week and a half to work on them. They'll look similar in terms of format as the last one. number of questions. You'll have to pick a few to answer. I am looking for comprehensive answers. So if you gave me just a couple of sentences last time, that was not what I was looking for. I want to see not just that you can spit back information from an open book test, which essentially it is, but I want to see that you can use it and that you can adapt the information to the circumstances that I present in the question. So I'm looking for things that are more in-depth, and also that if you quoted or borrowed information from the course, whether it was from, I'm less concerned about the webinar, but if it was unique to the webinar, because not everybody, it wasn't mandated to use the webinars, but from the course notes or from other parts, the readings, etc. Make sure that you somehow give credit, whether it's formal footnoting or it's from parentheses at the end of the section that you borrowed them from. So that's an important piece about the final exam. We do have another question here. Let me get to that. So Peter has one. We filed a petition with the NLRB for California Casino of Security Officers. We've had 2 days of hearing with the NLRB, who ruled against us on a jurisdictional issue. They're appealing to the rule to DC, the NLRB. 2007, they ruled in favor of communication workers and took jurisdiction in DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The tribe that presumably owns the casino is trying to use the tribal government to avoid the NLRB, basically saying they're a sovereign nation, claiming sovereign immunity, even though the officers that work at the casinos, is making money, is the only money-making enterprise on the reservation. Right. So that becomes a difficult case. So now you're tied up in the courts after the NLRB has said no, which, is going to take a while because you can delay courts, and they can appeal after there's a decision, presumably. So the difficulty is again, this is not just the union that Peter's working with, but any of our unions. Do we want to tie down to the only method that we've always used to organize workers, or can we broaden our appeal somehow? So that we don't get hung up on, and this is a classic case of, the employer not even dealing with the issue of don't vote for the union. They don't even have to put time into that. What they do is say, you can't organize these workers because they're part of a sovereign nation and therefore cannot be organized. Now, they may not win, they may not lose, we'll see what happens in the end. However, now the union is out of the ball game, at least temporarily. Now, hopefully they're maintaining contacts with card signers, etc. However, the employer now is going to spread the word around the casino that the campaign's over, that we won the charge and don't worry about it now, let's go back to business as usual, and they'll try to change the subject. So it becomes more difficult when we wed ourselves to this is the only way we organize. And again, I'm not faulting Peter or the union he's working with on this, but it just sort of, and I've been involved with sort of the traditional way of organizing, and I've gotten my teeth loosened up by being kicked a couple of times by the process. But it's just another way to think about how to go about organizing in the future. Anything else that you'd like the class to know, or anything you'd like to celebrate, along with an unfortunate decision from the NLRB, but anything you'd like to celebrate or anything that's happening as our clock runs down here in our last webinar. Okay. Well, it's been great having you guys in the webinar, and I think webinars are going to be something that I'll definitely be using in my courses in the future. I'll be teaching collective bargaining in the spring. I think it starts on March 31st, if I'm remembering correctly, and runs through early June. So you can, check the Cornell website for online credit-bearing courses for that, or just throw Alice an email asking for information about it. We are going to be, there's going to be a public employee labor relations course run by a good friend of mine, Jack Moody, who's a great instructor, and he will be teaching in January. And again, you can talk with, if you're interested in that, you can talk with Alice about registering for that also. There also are a couple of other courses that will be offered both in the winter term and in the spring term. I know that contemporary labor issues will be coming up, and I am forgetting the other one. But again, talk to Alice if you're interested in any of the offerings. You guys have been great participation in the class. I will turn around final grades as soon as I can with the after the finals are done. If for some reason you need more time and you can't make the final back to me by Wednesday, December 4th, please let me know before December 4th, because it just becomes that much more difficult. When I don't hear anything, you get an incomplete grade. And then what happens is a month or two later, I'll hear from a student saying, well, I got busy, and I understand that life happens, but some of the circumstances aren't necessarily, there wasn't anything critical, it's just they didn't let me know, and then they want me to somehow, you know, finish up the class for them in some way. And I try to be really good about that, because I understand that things do happen, but if you can let me know if you need more time, that's great. If I can know that well before December 1st or 4th, that's even better. Have a great Thanksgiving. Drive safely if you're traveling, and I hope if you have family that's traveling, I hope they travel safely. I hope this was helpful for you out there. If you have any questions about the course before the midterm, before the final, throw me an email like always. And you guys have been great, and I look forward to seeing you sometime in the future. Have a great night.